My name's Gavin Clark. I'm with the National Museum of Computing and with Reading Museum, and we are conducting oral histories into the 60th anniversary of DEC UK. And we are interviewing people who worked for DEC and were customers of DEC. This is December the 5th, 2023. And I'm here with Gavin Robinson. Gavin, please, could you just tell me your name and where you're from and your age, please?
My name's Gavin Robinson. I'm now 67, but back then I was a lot younger. And yes, I was born in London and raised in Acton and went to school in Acton. But in about 1975, Metalbox moved all of their headquarters staff up to Reading, and my mother was relocated to Reading, and the family came with us. So by then I'd left school at 18, having done my A-levels, and managed to get a job at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, which was a really interesting job, calibrating viscometers. And so when we moved to Reading, I worked out I could still continue with that job, and I commuted into Teddington from Reading.
So just tell us a little bit about your education, first of all.
Right.
What did you study at school, and did you go on to further education, or was it A-levels and then work?
Yeah, so I was sort of a scientific bent. I tended to do things like maths and physics, managed to do a bit of chemistry. Geology was the subject I was really interested in and thought my career was going to be in, but it wasn't to be. Nothing beyond A-level at that stage. So when I went to work for the civil service, they were very good at further education, and I started doing an HND. Gosh, I can't remember what the subject was, but it was something to do with electronics and physics.
And was that your naturally interested in technical subjects?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
Were you interested in those things at home as well? Did you make things, or you?
Yes, well, my father was very, very into that sort of things. He was a production engineer, and he built himself a car when he was about 18. So I was never quite as technical as him, but I was always interested in fiddling around with things and mucking around with bits of wire and making things work. I was naturally curious about things like that.
So something of a born fixer and a maker.
Sorry?
You were a born fixer and a maker.
I guess so, yeah, maybe.
And so your first job outside of school was then with National Physical Laboratory in Teddington?
That's right, yes. Went in as an assistant scientific officer, and so I was doing a day release. So one day a week I was coming, in fact, to Reading College here to study HND. And I had a really good boss, and it was just at the time when North Sea oil was coming about, and so there was a huge demand for viscometers which measure the viscosity of oil, and suddenly we were hit by this wave of these viscometers that needed calibrating, and it was good times, very satisfying to get find ways of processing 3 times as many viscometers as we ever had before. But I did get fed up with the commuting in the end, and so I got relocated to the Road Research Laboratory in Crowthorne. Very, very different job, very much about programming computers. They were basically trying to do a computer model of a car and simulate all sorts of things about cars, be it the amount of congestion on the roads or the way the car was operating. And I was sort of assisting some very clever intellectual people who were developing these bits of software. I didn't find it nearly as interesting as NPL, and it was a bit of a dead and alive atmosphere. I was still doing my studying, and it really became very apparent that without a degree I was never going to be promoted from the job that I was doing. So there was a level of dissatisfaction there. They had a guy there who was doing his doctorate, and he was given a mini computer which is the size of a wardrobe, wasn't a digital one. And he programmed this to simulate a car driving around a track. And having done this and having got his doctorate, he then promptly left the organisation. And they were left with this computer that they didn't know what to do with. So they said to me, Gavin, can you do anything with this at all? Just make it work, because we don't even know how to switch it on. So I sort of learned from scratch what a mini computer was, and from the programming knowledge that I had, managed to speed it up so that it became real time, because up to then it was going half the speed. A 2-minute drive around the track was taking 4 minutes. And just by a little bit of tweaking of the program, I managed to actually work in real time. And they were just over the moon with that, because at least it did something. But anyway, when I saw the advert,
so you saw an ad. So you're at this lab,
yeah,
and then it's going well, or are you a bit bored with the job?
I'm a bit bored with it.
Why
really.
was it just kind of too slow
It was
pace?
just so I knew that there was no future in it. Really, I was just going to be doing what I was doing. And there was no foreseeable future, to the extent that they needed some help in the kitchen cooking the staff lunches, and so I volunteered. Because the actual job itself was so boring.
So you referenced a job ad. You found a job ad in where was the job ad? How did you find it?
Well, my parents read the Daily Mail, and I used to just sort of scan down the adverts because I used to be quite interested. And then this one caught my eye, and it was asking for a field service engineer, and I thought, well, I know a little bit about computers. I sort of fiddle around with electrical things. I've got basic electrical knowledge. But the big thing was that they were giving you a company car. And my parents had been nagging me, because I always drove my mum's car, go and buy yourself a car. And I thought, I don't want to do that. It's a waste of money for me. I don't want to pay for a car, but here was a company that were going to give me one. So I thought, well, let's go for it. I haven't got much of a chance of getting it, but why not give it a go?
And the job ad was for what exactly? What did they
want? For field service engineers. So
what is a field service engineer?
Sorry?
And what is a field service engineer?
Right. A field service engineer was the people who went out and fixed the computers. It's difficult to believe it now, but computers were incredibly unreliable. The big mainframes, that would break every day. There'd be something wrong with them. They had an engineer on site continuously fixing problems with them. These smaller computers that Digital were introducing obviously were more reliable, but in my experience, quite a few of them would break on a monthly basis. They'd need something doing to them. I think the smaller they were, the more reliable they were, because I guess there were less components in them. So there was a huge need for, if you bought a computer, you bought with it a service contract, where you paid hundreds of pounds every year to have the facility to call an engineer in, sometimes within a guaranteed response time of an hour or two, to come in and fix the computer and get it running again.
And was there, we get the impression that at this point computers were still relatively new to people. The customers had very little idea about what they were doing, how to program them or how to maintain them.
Well, yes, they probably wouldn't, they wouldn't have had much understanding of the computer, but the digital computers definitely were very much used in scientific establishments. So places like the National Physical Laboratory, they were actually quite into computers. And so a lot of the computers I used to service were in places like the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, the nuclear establishments out in Bergfield and places like that, Aldermaston. And there were places like the Dairy Research Institute in just south of Reading. All of those had, they were the original market, as it were, for digital, because they didn't have the budgets that the big commercial organisations had. They couldn't justify a mainframe, but they had this experiment and they wanted to take the results from it and process those results and, as quickly as possible, produce something from it. So they bought these small computers and then they needed somebody to maintain them. So
What kind of things were DEC computers particularly difficult? I mean, compared to computers today, were they hard to figure out for people? There were more components in them, weren't there? So they made them.
yes, they were very, very modular. And a module was actually like a flat printed circuit board with pins down one side and handles on it that you could plug into what was called a backplane, which was a series of slots, which then had pins on the back. And there were all these wires on the back that made the connections between the pins. It was very cleverly done, but the moment you've got those sorts of connections in a computer, then only needs a bit of dust or dirt or something, and lo and behold, the thing's not working quite the way it should be working. And a few years later on, we had this, the PDP 1144s came out, and one of my colleagues said, "Oh, the way to fix these is just waggle it a bit." And he was quite right. The main fix for those computers, you went in and you waggled all the boards, and lo and behold, they would burst into life and work again. And it was just these connections in them.
Were you expected to fit hardware or software, or what kind of things were you expected to fit? Because they were very much more machines.
Purely hardware, purely hardware. Software was like a different universe back then. So although I'd been programming Fortran and things like that, I sort of left all that behind. And yeah, it was about bits and bytes. And we were given an oscilloscope to go in the back of the car, and big thick Roger manuals, and a microfiche machine. So a lot of information was provided on microfiche, which was, very, very small images, which you then needed to magnify out to read the manual.
What were you getting from that information?
Circuit diagrams, an explanation of how the thing works, and hopefully some sort of guide to how to troubleshoot it. The PDP 1110s were sort of the machines that were in the 1170s and the 1140s, so that were the 0 on the end, were the machines that were being sold when I joined digital, but they were just in the process of releasing the 1104s, 1134s, which were like the next step up. So they had a little bit more integration in them. They had a little bit more in them to help the field engineer diagnose problems. So whereas before I joined digital, to fix a computer you needed to get your oscilloscope out and actually look at the signals coming out of the machine and work out what was going on. The idea with these 34s and 04s, you no longer needed to do that. There were little test programs you could run, and they would test the memory and look for the memory location that wasn't working or whatever, and allow you to work out which of the modules was failing, and so you actually replaced a module rather than trying to replace a chip. So as a consequence of that big change, the level of technical ability that the engineers needed was much lower, which is why they came looking for people like me.
So let's go back to, you've seen the job ad.
Mm-hmm.
What happened next?
So, yes, I applied for the job and there was a long silence, which is implied by the letter, and I thought, oh, well, I didn't get anywhere with that.
You wrote a letter? How would job start?
Yeah, I guess it would have been a letter. Yeah. That was the only way of applying for a job in those days. Sent them in your CV. But eventually I did get a letter from Digital saying that they'd had a huge response to the advert. They were looking to recruit 20 engineers across the UK and put them through an intensive training course, because they recognised there weren't many computer skills out there. There were nobody out there they could recruit and just give them a car and send them out there. They needed to train people. So they'd had roughly, I believe it was about 2,000 applicants for these 20 positions. And so they hired a hotel in London and had a big day where anybody that they thought was vaguely possible was called up there. And I was expecting them to go up there and be quizzed on my technical knowledge. But actually there was virtually no technical content to the day at all. The core of the recruitment process was doing like a questionnaire, which was like a test, which was testing your logical ability, your ability to be rational, make rational decisions, and the way that you thought about things and the way you approached problems. And what apparently they'd done was they'd got this questionnaire and they'd given it to all their best engineers and said, fill this in. And what they were looking for were people that made the same mistakes as those guys and came up with the same sort of answers as them. They weren't looking for somebody who actually answered everything right. They were looking for somebody similar to their best engineers. And so on that basis, luckily, I was given a second interview. And even more luckily for me, I was the only person in the Reading area that had come through that process. And so I can't say that my second interview was the most brilliant interview I've ever given.
Describe a second interview. So the first stage was a questionnaire, second stage, who was at the interview, and was it just one-on-one?
Well, I mean, it was just a massive, great, heaving mass of people, really. There were just hundreds of us there. And I'd say it wasn't, yes, there was a short interview where they just ran through your CV and just asked you a few questions about what you'd done to date. But then we were all sort of filed into a big room, a bit like a school exam, you know, and we sat down and were given an hour or whatever it was to fill in this questionnaire. And then they said, thank you very much, we'll be in touch. So, yeah, it was a very unusual experience.
So you never experienced anything like that before?
No.
How did it feel?
No.
Were you kind of get a sense, at this point, are you getting a sense of DEC? Because you didn't really approach it for the technology. Obviously you had lifestyle choices were driving you towards DEC, weren't they, I think?
Well, bear in mind I come from a very regimented work environment. The civil service was very, very, you know, rule-based, and everything was very sort of, you know, formal, and, you know, you just were a cog in a massive great machine. And you were not expected to show any sort of initiative or anything like that unless you got to a really senior level. And this was just so informal and so sort of laid back. And, you know, obviously I went quite, you know, nervous about the whole process, but actually I found it always quite enjoyable, really, which is interesting.
So a pleasant surprise. Are you getting? Did you come away that with a sense of knowing a bit more about DEC, or did you start doing any research on DEC anymore? Still not interested to that extent?
No, I don't think there was the time really to tell us much about digital, but I'm pretty sure we were given some stuff to take away with us. One of them might have been that leaflet that I've got over there, which just gave you a bit of background to the fact, you know, this was a massive American company. They'd sort of established a presence in the UK, and, you know, the number of PCs they were selling, well, they didn't call them PCs back then, mini computers they were selling was just going off the scale, and they desperately needed to expand. And that was the whole problem that digital faced at that stage. They just couldn't recruit people fast enough, and they couldn't take on office space fast enough to cope with the demand. To the extent that there were quite a few companies out there that piggybacked on top of digital.
How do you mean?
Like, well, I think there was a company called Systime who literally took digital computers, changed the badge on the front, and then sold them as Systime computers. And I think they put a clock in them or something so that they could claim it was a different product. But they weren't entirely very popular within digital because they were seen as sort of taking away some of our market. But then there were other companies out there. Solar Twin was one that came to my mind. Solartron, who were based in Farnborough. And they were doing things like the military. They would establish a need with the military. What the military needed was a computer, but they needed it to do this specific task. And so they would customize it. And so they would buy, you know, 20, 30, 40 of these PDP machines, each one the size of a wardrobe. They had a massive, great working area, and they just had all these computers all set up, and they were basically had engineers working on them all, customizing them for their end customer. And so huge volumes of these things.
So let's get back to your interview. So you've had the interview or the survey questionnaire, and then what happens next? How long do you wait? What happened next?
So the next thing I had, I don't quite know how long it was, but I don't think it was long afterwards. I had a telegram to say I'd been selected for a second interview and could I come to King's Road, building that's still there, just opposite the college. And it was a scruffy, messy place. I seem to remember it felt very cramped. I think that's what it was. They were just so cramped in there. And met my future boss in there, Jim Abbots, who was then one of the managers of the field service department for digital, which is based in Portman Road. And Jim was an unusual character. I struggled to describe him really, but he was very, very laid back sort of guy and very easygoing and never seemed to take anything very seriously. Not my impression of a manager at all. And there was me, really nervous. And again, he probably didn't grill me at all. He just had a chat with me and described a little bit about what the job was going to be like and said, would you be interested? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, well, we'll think about it. And within a few days, I got a letter saying, can I start? And the first thing that was going to be was a 7-week training course.
So what's your response? You got the job and they notified you by
I was, yes, very happy. I don't think I quite realised what I'd let myself into at that stage. But I knew it was going to be so different to what I had been doing, I was a little bit nervous because it was out there going onto actual customer sites, working on customer sites. I'd always been stuck in an office all day with the same people every day, and you can build up relationships and that sort of thing. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to cope with it, but I thought, well, let's give it a go. Let's see, it's worth a try.
So they sent you a notification. I think you got a letter or a telegram of acceptance.
I got the telegram was for my second interview, but I got a letter for the actual appointment. Yeah, together with a whole raft of stuff. And I remember one of the first things they wanted to do was a medical, and it's the most thorough medical I've ever had in my life, which was with my local GP. And he literally, didn't leave any stones unturned. And I was thinking, I wonder what he's going to find, I'd never had such an in-depth medical. But, that was all part of the process. And then I turned up at this office, which was Portman Road, which is, again, a scruffy place, really. There were bits of computer in all directions. The managers were in little pig pens, each had a little pig pen, and then half the building was all the spares and components, which we called logistics. And all of the engineers were working out of there. So I think the engineers had one desk, and there were at that then probably 20 engineers sharing one desk, but of course they were out fixing computers. And I think I had about a week in there before the training started. The training centre being on the 7th floor of Fountain House.
And what was training? So 7 weeks of intense training. Describe what it was like, what you did.
So we started off with the real basics. This is a computer and these are the components and this is how it works. And then we sort of moved on to how to bootstrap a computer. You had to, in those days, you had to type in a little mini program, which some of the older PDPs, the ones with the 0 on the end, the 10s and the 70s and the 40s, they had a set of keys on the front, and you actually literally had to program in that bootstrap program. And then, providing you'd done it right, you then hit go, and it ran a little program, and it then used to then feed in a paper tape, and the tape plate loaded up a bigger program, and and it sort of built up to the point where you actually had something running. Now the We weren't really being trained on those, although a lot of the training machines were those, so we still had to become familiar with them. We were being trained on these 1134s and 1104s, and they had this, what would be like a calculator keypad on the front, and they actually had the boot strap in the computer, so you didn't have to key it in. So you actually just press boot and it would run the program for you. And they started using floppy disks rather than paper tape. So they then would boot up on the floppy disk. So we were learning about the floppy disks, how they worked. And then they had various disk drives. I think when I first joined, there were the RK07s, which were, gosh, I can't remember the capacity of them, but it must have been about 200 megabytes or something, or perhaps half a megabyte. So I don't mean 200 megabytes, 200 kilobytes or half a megabyte. And
It's always all this information is coming at you. How are you feeling about this?
yeah,
What's it like?
it's all fascinating. It's just really, really interesting stuff for me. They were quite dangerous, those sort of RK07s, because they moved so fast, and they were all done with electromagnets. And basically, put your finger in the wrong place, your finger would be off. So you had to be careful. But I think later on in my training, we were trained on this brand new product, which is called the RLO1. And that, I think the disk capacity was a megabyte. And that was revolutionary because it worked on a completely different principle. Whereas up to then, all the disk drives, you had to really accurately calibrate them so that they went to the right place and found the data. And only by calibrating the disk drive did you find the data. These actually had a pattern encoded on the disk drive, which told the disk drive where it was, so it could actually find the data. And so if it was misaligned, it didn't matter, because it just said, oh, I'm in the wrong place, and it moved to the right place. And the consequence of that was they made the whole thing a lot simpler and a lot safer to work on, and very, very modular. And there was always lots of stories when in digital, but the story was that the guys who designed the first RLO1 built it in mahogany, and they came in with this big mahogany box, and all the working components were in a mahogany box, which was always sounded quite interesting. So I love the RLO1s because they were just a dream to work on. From a service, somebody of my technical knowledge, I could really understand them and really fix them really easily.
So tell me a little bit about, in what environment are you learning? Is it classrooms? Is it lecture halls? Is it in a field?
It was a mixture of classroom and practical stuff. They had a big lab area with about, I don't know, 3 or 4 computers that our class were working on, and then there were another half dozen or so, all different sizes and shapes. Most of them had been pulled to pieces and put back together more times than we've had cups of tea, so they were not in the best condition. But I think it was a testament to the technology that they still worked, having been treated in that way. So I had 7 weeks of training.
Who were your students? Who was everyone else's background?
Right.
Did you make friends, make acquaintances there?
Yeah, so there were about 20 engineers that they recruited. I don't remember there being 20 on the course. Maybe they put them into 2 batches. There were probably about 10 of us. But they were guys from all over the country. And most of them were ex-British Telecom engineers. Most of them had been working on telephones up till then. So, in a way, they'd had a lot more hands-on practical experience than me, but probably no more knowledge of computers than I. Because they were coming from places like Birmingham and Manchester and Glasgow and Newcastle, they were all put up in the post house, I think it was, in Reading. Whereas me being local, I had to go home every night. So they were going off every night, going down the pub and having a whale of a time, and I was just having to go home every night. So it was a little bit strange from my point of view, because I couldn't, I didn't become part of the gang, as it were. But it was just such a relaxed, easygoing atmosphere. Everybody's been really friendly, really supportive, and helping each other, and you know, all I think quite excited about, you know, what we'd got ourselves into.
And did you, again, is there a sense of what digital is at this point starting to dawn upon you about what it is? Because as we said, it's more of a lifestyle choice for you up until.
Yes, I think, yes. I certainly thought, you know, finally, you know, I feel like I'm getting a life, I think. Yeah.
And how old were you at this point?
I must have been about 22, I think. Yeah.
So you've completed training. Your first customer job. Can you remember your first customer job?
Well, I know that the first thing I did when I came off training, I was given another engineer to shadow. I wasn't allowed out there on my own. And that's when I came across Solutron, because the guy I was shadowing, he spent a lot of time at Solutron helping them install these computers that they bought, you know, dozens of them, getting them set up, troubleshooting any problems that they had on them. And he was a really, really good guy. I'm just trying to think what his name was. He was probably, well, he seemed like a really old man to me, but he was probably in his mid-40s or something. And he was sort of person very much like me, very methodical, sort of somebody wanted to be organised. He was, a lot of the older engineers were really into the electronics and the chip chasing and that. He was less turned on by that. He wanted to get himself organised, understand this is the typical problem on this computer. This is, you know, for each type of computer, he taught himself the best way of coming to a fix as quickly as possible and being methodical about it. So I spent a lot of time with him, and he was really, really helpful in helping me to understand how to succeed as a field engineer. Probably learnt as much from him as I did from the training, really.
Was there any kind of anything he gave you, any kind of insight he gave on how to succeed? Because there's training in the classroom, isn't there, as you said, and there's the kind of the more, I suppose, the organic approach.
Yeah,
And
he was much more telling me how to deal with the customers, you know, and what their expectations would be of me, and, you know, how to approach it. When you went to fix something, there were big sort of suitcases full of spare parts that logistics held. So if you went to fix an RL01 disk, there would be a case full of spares for the RL01. And so you could phone up logistics and say, can you send me the RL01 kit, please? And they literally had taxis coming and going, you know, every 5 minutes. And so they would go on the phone to the taxi company, taxi would go up, they'd throw the box in the taxi, and that would then meet me at the customer site. By the time I got there, hopefully the spare part would be there and I would have what I need. So there was a bit of judgment there, because you didn't want to order up one of these things if you didn't need it. So, you know, the first thing was to talk to the customer and try and understand, you know, well, what happened when it failed? How's it failing? You know, was it working all right yesterday? What's changed? That was the first thing to ask yourself, what's changed since it was working? And work out whether it actually was going to be a hardware problem, or whether you thought, I know what's happened here. You know, the built underneath dropped off or something, and there were lots of sort of known problems that you could fix very quickly once you knew these products.
And did you have like a set number of products you specialised in, like, or was it across lots?
By and large, yes.
So what were the ones you specialised in?
Bear in mind that the things that the 1104s and the 1134s were very much at the low end from digital's point of view. You know, the stuff they'd sold up to then were bigger machines, the size of half a dozen wardrobes, which were used in places like air traffic control and that. And very often they were forming a very critical purpose, you know. If the air traffic control system went down, that was quite serious, really. Whereas these smaller machines were being sold very much, as I said to you before, into research labs, government labs. A few, I mean, for instance, Caversham Laundry, which I think is now called something else, isn't it? But it's just by Caversham Bridge. They were actually the first customer I went to on my own, and they were fairly unique in as much as they were doing their payroll on a computer. But that was only just coming in, that sort of commercial use of computers. So, yeah, sorry, I forget what your question was.
That's the good question. So how did it feel on your first customer trip? Caversham Laundry is your first customer. How did it go? How did you feel? Nervous?
So I think they sent me there because they were nice customers and they knew that, the guy there was a really nice guy. They probably said to him, "Look, we're sending you our new engineer, but treat him gently, Yeah, I went in there and did what I'd been told to do, ran my little programs, diagnostic programs, and it came up and said it was a memory error. So I ordered up a memory card and slotted it in, and it worked. And that was really nice. The first site I went to, I actually managed to fix the computer without any assistance. I think it might have been a few weeks later before I did the second one, but my first one was, a success. And I always enjoyed going to Caversham Laundry. There were such nice people there.
So let's talk about the British Gas Mapping Project, which sounds like a large thing.
Yes.
That you listed that as one of the something you were involved in that you kind of remember particularly fondly, or is significant for you. What was that? And what
that was much later, because I spent 16 years at Digital. My first 8 years were in field service, and after I'd been in field service for 3 or 4 years, they worked out that I was a very organised, methodical sort of person, and they started getting me to come into the office to try and help organise the engineers. And then they said to me, would you like to do the management training? So I went off and did management training. But I did several months of management training and came back and did all sorts of things which to put me in sort of situations where I had to manage engineers and customers. And I think it became obvious really that while I was brilliant at the organisation and the management of getting engineers to site, getting the right engineer to site quickly and all that sort of stuff, I wasn't really cut out to be a manager. And eventually they said to me, Gavin, do you really want to do this? It's your decision. They didn't say you can't do it, but they could see that I was really stressed out by it. And I said, no, I think, I don't think I'm really cut out to do this.
Well, let's talk about that because obviously DEC has we understand a lot from DEC had a very supportive management structure, didn't it?
Yeah.
It seems DEC was very good at pushing people, encouraging people to take on new courses and experiences. So they had, your manager had put you forward maybe for this training role, had they? How did this come about?
Yeah.
And
I mean, bear in mind, field engineers were being trained at least once a year. You went off on a training course and learned a new puller. So management training, in a way, was just another training course, but it was a much more significant training course. There were about 8 of us, I think, on the course, and it was based on a hotel in Cirencester. And we were sort of shut in the hotel for at least 2 weeks, being trained on what it took to be a manager, and then being going through exercises to try and, negotiation techniques and all those sorts of things, and going through real life exercises where we had to try and, make things happen. And then we came back and we were put in charge of a part of the branch that you were at. Then you went off and did some more training, and then eventually you were shipped off to a completely different office where you had to try and manage a part of the organisation in an office that you'd never worked in. So we didn't know any of the people and didn't know any of the customers, and that's when I really began to find it stressful.
And how did your manager pick up on this, or did you talk to them? How did it come about?
It was completely their suggestion to me that I should do this training, because I said to you, whenever anything needed organising, it was always, Gavin, could you organise this? Because, you're one of the most, I was in no way one of the most technical engineers, but I was always very organised And, I worked on the very small stuff, but I was getting round about 4 or 5 customer sites a day sometimes, whereas most engineers were getting through 1 or 2. That was partly because I was fixing small stuff, but it was also partly because I was very organised and, didn't waste any time on waiting for parts, and things like that.
But they
So
noticed,
that's why I was chosen to go into it, really.
but then they noticed, or you spoke to them, made it clear that management wasn't for you. Did they sense this management wasn't for you, or did you go to them and say this isn't for me? And what was the next?
Well, they used to be regular, I can't remember how often, but every month or two, the managers, all the field service managers in our branch used to get together and have a meeting, and I was called into the meeting and sort of went through a 2-monthly interview process about, what I'd learned, what had happened to me, how was I feeling, and how was it going, all that sort of thing. And the guy, one of the managers had to sponsor you, and John Dick was the guy who sponsored me, and I think he was a similar personality to me, and so that's why he was very keen on me. And, in a way, I felt the pressure from him to carry on doing it because he really believed I could do it. But I think some of the other managers were thinking, is John, really doing the right thing here? And so they gave me the opportunity to say that I didn't want to take it any further. They made it easy for me to do that because they could see that actually it was the best thing for me. I mean, Digital was doing all this because they were desperate for managers. They couldn't get enough managers, and they needed managers who understood the business. So it made absolute sense to recruit from within the organisation.
But there's a concept here of pushing people too hard, and it seems while DEC was management was willing to make sure it had this culture, didn't it, of do the right thing and promote your staff and personal advancement. It seems interesting that they should be aware that they were pushing you in the wrong direction, because often we see it as a positive, don't we? Like getting people onwards and upwards. But
they tried to put you in pressured situations and see how you react. So they weren't wanting to give you an easy ride, but having put you in that situation, they then wanted to know, right, well, how did you feel? How did you cope with that? And to try and understand what your needs were, so they could either give you more training that would help you
how does that
cope with that.
How does that make you feel, I suppose, about the DEC culture or the DEC management, that they're kind of watching you like this, and they have this kind of view of you, not just either ignoring you, when you want to pay a rise, you come to them, or they're trying to promote you, or they're being aware enough to kind of say, I think this isn't working out. I mean, did this kind of give you a sense of, did this make you feel any positive way about the company? Did you kind of start having, how does this kind of reinforce, I suppose, your loyalty?
Well, I felt very supported, I think. I mean, just universally supported by everybody. I knew there were 1 or 2 that were more cynical about my abilities than others, but even they, would never openly criticise you. Everybody was supportive. All the field engineers were really supportive because they liked the fact that one of their number was, and I wasn't the only person. There was another guy called Dave Hadnett who was also picked out and went through the training, and he very quickly found himself in that management position. He took like a duck takes to water, but all the administrative people were really supportive. It was just such a supportive atmosphere. I think everybody saw working for Digital as just hugely enjoyable, and also quite financially rewarding as well. There was always loads of overtime on offer. There were lots of service engineers out there working 60, 70-hour weeks, purely because they wanted to gain enough money to go off and do their own thing. And I know several ex-DEC engineers who retired at 50 because that was their objective.
So there is a sense of people enjoying it, but also a sense of not working. It sounds like everyone was very busy. How could you avoid burnout, which is something we hear about today, isn't it?
Yeah, well, probably we were all young. I think most people were under 30. Even the senior managers were probably in their early 30s. So, but
how was management? You mentioned Jim
I think,
Abbott, so your interview, you said he was surprised, he was very relaxed, not what you expected from a manager. You came from a civil service background. How were the management generally, their kind of philosophy or their their organisation of you, as it were? How was it a very positive experience working with management? Was it, we hear they let you pretty much get on, you had your own device, you worked with your own devices, you weren't told too much what to do?
no, you were given a lot of flexibility, and that was a sort of person who took advantage of that, really. That, if you went to them and said, look, why don't we do it this way? I mean, let's face it, the business we were in was constantly changing because there were new models coming out. The PDPs were replaced by the VAXs, the disk drives were changing, everything was changing. We went from everybody fixing everything to specialising on different sizes of computer to then specialising where we had a disk drive specialist, so we stopped working on the main engineers were working mostly on the actual PCs and not on the disk drives. Things were constantly changing, so there was always opportunity to say, why don't we do it this way? And there was that huge flexibility there. And I think it was quite interesting, really, because you were aware of the fact that there was this huge organisation back in the USA, but the UK was allowed to run itself by and large. There were no huge restrictions on the way that the UK could organise it. So quite often we were doing things slightly different to how they were doing in the US, and that was accepted, really. And then the UK was used as a springboard into Europe. There was massive growth in Europe.
So you had, as an individual, you had a huge amount of flexibility in your job role. Were you given a great deal? Do you feel you had a great deal of responsibility given to you as a result?
Yeah. You were just, and if you made a mistake, you made a mistake. As long as you learned from it, that was fine. Again, there were various stories about, floating around digital about how Ken Olsen, the leader, forgave people making massive mistakes. That was very ingrained in you. If you make a mistake, don't worry about it, own up to it, learn from it and move on. Let's face it, the company had plenty of money, so it could afford for people to make mistakes.
And it had a very engineering-driven culture as well, obviously. Did that come across? Obviously, you have a technical background, but were you aware of the engineering culture at all, as opposed to a business? Maybe it was a business, but
yeah, I guess yes. I wasn't heavily involved in that. Obviously, Tech Park was built, and there were lots of engineers in there. My brother-in-law was an engineer, and I very much felt they were given the time. They tended to be very enthusiastic, very committed, very motivated people, but they weren't given tight deadlines by and large. They were given the time to develop the ideas they were working on and come up with something that really worked. Once I'd left field service, I was in field service for 8 years, I then went to work in DEC Park alongside part of Digital UK, which is called Computer Special Systems. When I joined Digital, Computer Special Systems was in Arkwright Road. And as you walk down Arkwright Road, there were about 6 or 7 buildings there, and all of those buildings were CSS, and different bits of CSS were in different buildings. And then when DEC Park was built, they all moved into DEC Park, and about 25% of DEC Park 1, the original building, was Computer Special Systems. And then, so that's when I moved from field service. I went to work in DEC Park. And then I'd only been working there a year or two when they said, we're bursting at the seams in Reading. We bought this massive piece of land down in Southampton, a whole business park. They bought the whole thing. And we're going to move CSS down to Southampton. And we were all relocated down to Southampton.
So tell me a little bit about, because we need to get back to British Gas, Computer Special Systems. What did that group do?
Right, so Computer Special Systems, they did 2 things really. They were sort of there to provide a bit of flexibility to what digital could offer customers. And one of the things they did was very much like Solutron were doing. They were trying to get into this thing where the customer said, yeah, I like your computers, but I want it to do this specific task, and in order to do that I need this special hardware, and I need it to be, I mean, the obvious one really is you want to put a computer on a submarine. You can't just wheel in your normal computer and stick it on a submarine. It needs to be mounted in the right mountings. It needs to be able to cope with the environment of a submarine, and so there was quite a lot of work being done for things like the Royal Navy and that by CSS, taking standard bits of kit and adapting it to their environment. So British Gas was one of those really. It was one of the later ones, so it was much more, as time progressed, things become much less about sort of scientific customers and much more about commercial environments. And here we have British Gas, who had this huge amount of paper records of where their gas pipes were located throughout the UK. And bear in mind that British Gas, I don't know, had 7 or 8 regions, lots of little offices all over the country, and each office had their set of paper drawings. And what they wanted to do was have a standard digitised system right the way across the whole of British Gas, get rid of paper, put everything onto computer. And in order to do that, they needed to digitise these drawings. And these are big A0 size drawings. So what they went out to tender really, and CSS tendered for this piece of business, which was to provide them with the digitisers and the printers and the computers and the software to allow them to basically install this set of equipment in each of their offices, wherever they had offices with drawings, and then undertake a 2 or 3 year program of digitising all these maps. So a lot of what CSS were producing for British Gas was fairly standard, but they needed a big A0 size colour plotter, and there was not one in digital standard printer range, so they had to buy one in from another company, and basically they were supplying it with the digital guarantee on it, which meant it needed to be serviced by digital engineers. And then these big A0 digitisers were the things that I got involved in, and I've got a picture of one I can show you later on. But British Gas wanted them motorised, so they wanted to be able to adjust the height and the tilt of them, and so that their guys who are working could get themselves really comfortable while working on these things. And the moment you put all these motors in, there were all sorts of safety switches that needed to be built in so they didn't cut anybody's legs off. And that brings us to my job, which was, as an ex-service engineer, I was taken on to provide a link between CSS and our service organisation. So this was really quite a big thing within digital, that probably about the time I joined, they realised that while you can get a techie guy to produce this fantastically amazing, groundbreaking computer, he's got absolutely no idea what a service engineer does. And so tends to build it in a way where it's completely unserviceable, and when it breaks, it's impossible to repair. So the service organisation employed people to sit alongside these brilliant techie guys and look over their shoulder at what they were doing and say, if you were to do it that way, it's going to be a lot easier to service the thing. And as a service engineer, I noticed that on the older kit, you open the back, and if you weren't careful, you electrocuted yourself, and once or twice I did. With the new stuff, it was safe, and that was these service CSSE guys, they were called, which stood for Customer Services Systems Engineering, and they were there saying, look, you can't leave exposed mains, you've got to cover it up, right the way through to, we need a manual for this thing, we need diagnostic programs, we need this, we need that. So my job when I worked with CSS was to look at what they were doing and try to ensure that when this product ended on the customer site, the service engineer would actually know what they were doing. And CSS were perhaps not the best from a service engineer's point of view, because they tended to go out and get these completely unique things and sell them to customers. So they bought in these A0 color plotters, which was like technology that no service engineer had ever seen before in digital, and say, oh yes, of course we'll service them. So it was my job to make sure there was training in place, manuals in place, perhaps even an agreement with the original supplier that they would provide backup, technical backup. With the digitizers, I had to make sure there were spares, and the spares for these things were enormous because of the size of them. You know, so if one failed, we actually had a spare one available. The engineers, I had to run training courses for the engineers. So I actually, went and booked a training place in Reading and arranged for all the service branches to send an engineer in to be trained on these bits of kit, so that when they got the British Gas site, and inevitably they were not 100% reliable, that the service engineers were not sort of overwhelmed, shall we say. So that was a really interesting job, really.
And when was that, and how long did the project take?
I think British Gas project probably took at least 18 months, maybe 2 years. On the surface, it sounded really, really straightforward, but the more they got into the detail, the more complicated it got. And they started doing, I think there was an upgrade that they had to do to these digitizers because they found they didn't quite work the way they did. And so then I had to get involved in the upgrade, and it was a fairly substantial part of my work. But there were lots of other things going on as well.
How big was the overall project?
Financially,
Possible to quantify, like just size of? Was it a
Well,
huge prestige project? Was it like
I
a big
think it
project
was
for DEC?
certainly from CSS's point of view, it was quite a prestigious thing, because unlike a lot of the defence stuff and that they couldn't talk about, it was something they were allowed to talk about and allowed to promote. To say, look, we've got this capability to produce the end solution to you. But it wasn't cheap, all this stuff needed engineering input, needed project management input, it needed input from people like myself, and, they were charging a good hourly rate for people, and it all added up. Quite an expensive, if you think in today, you can go and buy a anal digitizer for 500 quid or something, British Gas were spending tens of thousands of pounds on these things. There was a lot of money being spent. But there was a big benefit to them that they were going to get rid of all these paper records and move into the 20th century, as it was then.
This is what, 1980s era?
That would have been, yes, late 80s. Yeah.
And you were part of Computer Special Systems at this point.
Yes. Although originally I was employed by Customer Services Systems Engineering, eventually customer services, things were getting a little bit tighter in digital, and everybody was starting to count the pennies a little bit more. And so customer services turned around and said, look, we're providing you with 3 people here to make, if you didn't have our people, you wouldn't be able to sell your products, basically. And so there was this big question, well, are we going to make you redundant, or are CSS going to take you on? And they said, no, absolutely, we can't do what we're doing unless we have these guys. So we were actually taken on by CSS to work for them. And then we started having to account for all of our time, and you account for every half hour.
So this is the point where DEC is starting to change, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Something's in the wind at this point. I mean, the company's facing a lot of competition.
Yeah.
Commoditization of computing is happening.
Yeah.
the management is changing as well, isn't it? Were you aware of this happening? I mean, that's obviously an interesting. You sense something there. Were you getting other kind
I
of
think
flags
there was
going
a
up?
big change towards um, being aware of what they were spending. So that, they brought in this thing where everybody was having to account for their time, and the time was being directly billed to a customer. Whereas up to then, they'd gone out and said, oh yeah, we'll do that for £10,000, and then went away and did it, and it cost £20,000. Oh dear, we made a huge loss on that. But never mind, we'll put it down to experience. To one where, yes, we'll do that for you. We're going to charge you, for our engineers' times, Mr. Customer. We expect it to cost this much, but we're not guaranteeing that, because if you ask for more, if you ask for changes, we will be billing you for the extra time spent. And it was getting a lot tighter from that point of view. Customers were getting away in the old days with all sorts of, oh, could you just do this for us? And, oh yeah, we'll do that, to one where, yes, we can do that, but it's going to cost you an extra amount of money. So just being a lot more financially aware. And in a way, I think CSS were ahead of the game compared with a lot of digital on that, in being cost aware. The nature of their business and the fact they were very process driven and very organised in the way they went about things, that they were one of the first ones to really start, being, I suppose, business-like is always how you describe it.
How did that change? Did that change, I suppose, the relationship with the customer? Because until then, I imagine they looked at you quite favourably. You were giving them freebies, free support to an extent.
Yeah.
Now everything's by the book and by the spreadsheet. How did that?
Yes,
did it make
I
it more
felt, I
difficult?
think, that a lot more pressure, because customers were expecting you to deliver, and you were directly talking to customers about products that you were selling them. To me, that was completely new. I'd always been sort of one step removed, really, from the customer conversation, but now I was having to go to customer sites, and be professional. I mean, I'd done it as a service engineer, but now I was almost on the selling side. When they were selling this thing to British Gas, I was part of the team that went in, and I had to give them presentations about what it was I was going to give to British Gas for all the money they were giving us. So it was a lot more pressured. Excuse me. But that was, by then I was ready for that. I was quite enjoying it. It was interesting.
So DEC is changing by this point, and the customers are becoming, they're expecting it's become more cut and dried what you give them or they expect from you. Were you finding the customers are becoming more distant from DEC at this point anyway? Was the nature of a relationship changing, becoming a bit cooler maybe?
I think yes, in as much as it tended to be in the past that they really, to an extent, was no competition for what we were finding. There were cheaper options out there, but it was recognised that actually if you want the damn thing to work and do what you want it to do, then you buy the digital machine. And so they were out there trying to justify to their bosses why they wanted to spend an extra 10% and get the digital rather than something else. And I'd seen that really, that when I moved into digital in the first place, that machine that I'd worked on way back in the civil service wasn't a DEC machine and wasn't built to nearly the same standard as the DEC ones. But now there was a lot more competition out there, certainly when we were working on British Gas. And so customers had alternatives. They had other companies they could go to. So the pressure was on you.
And you left after 15 years. What were the circumstances? Why did you finally leave DEC? Because I mean, you've been there for a long time. They've shown you a lot of loyalty. You've given them a lot of your life. Why did you leave after 15 years?
Well, digital were having to downsize, having been in this situation where they couldn't take on people fast enough. They couldn't buy enough buildings. They bought this massive, great industrial estate down in Southampton and built one building on it, and then they built an extension. And we were looking at this view thinking, one day this will be full of digital, offices. And then suddenly it was, we need to downsize, we need to get rid of people. And it was quite a shock, really, a huge shock, really. And obviously, the first sort of round of redundancies was perhaps relatively easy. there's always dead wood in an organisation. There are always people that, they brought them on and perhaps had a really useful role, but now things have moved on and there wasn't really quite a role for them anymore. So it's quite easy with those early stages to find people. But, as you went through one set of redundancy and then lo and behold, you heard there was another set coming from. And all this was being driven by the US, the need to downsize. And CSS were perhaps trying to step back from that a little bit and saying, well, if we can get enough business in, we can justify not getting rid of people. But they were struggling to bring in the amount of business that they had traditionally. The world was changing. One of the things CSS had been really good at was producing little tiny computers. Well, of course, things were getting smaller anyway, so the market for a slightly smaller VAX was a lot reduced on what it was in the past, and the kit was getting far more complicated, so it's becoming far more difficult to do what they'd done in the past. So CSS, unfortunately, were also finding it difficult. And so they were saying, yeah, we do need to participate in these redundancy programs. And they started asking for people to volunteer. And by that stage, I was getting a little, I'd been doing this for eight years. And I was finding it, we were getting more into software, which I didn't enjoy so much. And software maintainability, is a very different thing to hardware maintainability and wasn't really my expertise. But I was being asked to, how can you make this software easy to maintain? And it was just a whole new ballgame for me, which wasn't really up my street. So I decided to put my name forward to volunteer.
How did you feel about that? I mean, that's a big commitment, isn't it?
It was a big commitment. It was partly where I was in my life at the time. I was really interested in conservation and doing a lot of things, planting trees and wildlife and all that sort of stuff. And I really wanted to do more of that. Meanwhile, my wife was at home with the children and tearing her hair out because she couldn't cope with being at home all day. She wanted to be working, and she was a systems analyst. So, there was lots of work opportunity out there. So we decided to make the change, and that she would go back to work and I would take the redundancy, which was quite a good package and sufficient to pay off our mortgage. So, that was quite something to be able to actually say, well, your house without a mortgage. And it was a big decision for us, really. But we actually then ended up moving over to Essex while I went on did a degree in countryside management. Complete change, and it was just so nice to be out of that office environment. I just had enough of it. Now, yeah, if digital had kept changing and kept growing, I probably would have found another role within digital, but of course there was nothing to move on to by that stage. So it was in retrospect a really good move.
How did the redundancy go down? Was there, again, was DEC kind of sympathetic, supportive? Was it very much process?
Yes. I mean, it was seen as very generous, and there was always the threat that the next set of redundancies was going to be less generous. Digital had a lot of money in the bank, but they didn't know what to do with it. And, to be honest, they used it to get rid of staff, which seems a bit sad, but they just didn't seem to be able to find the right business opportunity to invest in to keep the growth that they'd had in the past. And obviously, the whole of digital culture had been about growing and growing and growing, and suddenly it was about downsizing, and that the whole atmosphere was different, really.
How would you could describe the atmosphere of what it had been, obviously, with working with colleagues and the excitement, the energy of the early years and what had become? How would you contrast
I mean, in the past, it was an exciting place, and you always wonder what was going to happen, what's going to be the next development, and you're always learning new things. And suddenly it was just all about trying to cut costs and do things twice as fast as you used to, and being smart, which there was a certain satisfaction in becoming more streamlined about the way you did things. But it was getting to the point where you'd done all the easy stuff, and now it was getting to really perhaps do the job slightly less well than you'd done in the past, because you didn't have time to do it to your satisfaction, or trying to do things in ways that weren't optimal, just to save money. So yeah.
So you had great memories. You got great stories there. I noticed one thing we didn't discuss was the fire in the CSS computer room, wasn't there?
Oh well, that was back when I was a service engineer, and yes, there was a fire in the CSS computer room when we were in DEC Park. I think one of the machines over the weekend or something burst into flames, and while in those days, computers were in big computer rooms, and those computer rooms were fitted with halon fire suppression. And actually, I was in a computer room in Maidenhead when the halon went off, and it was like a huge explosion. It just exploded when this halon went off, and I thought, I think I'd better get out of here, because in a minute there's going to be no oxygen left. So this happened over the weekend in DEC Park and put the fire out very quickly. But what happened was all the air conditioning in the computer room had taken the smoke and blown it into every machine in the computer room. And so every single piece of kit in that room had to be deinstalled, shipped off to a specialist company that cleaned everything, cleaned all the components, and then returned and reinstalled and recommissioned and put back in place again. So being quite an organised sort of person and sort of on this management stream, I was asked if I could manage that. So, I managed the process of shipping all of those computers out. And basically, CSS were trying to, meanwhile, do their everyday business. So we had to draw up a schedule with them about which machines were going to be installed. They were installed over the weekend, shipped out for the week, and the following weekend they were reinstalled again. It took about 3 months, I think, to get them all cleaned and reinstalled again.
How big an impact did it have on DEC or CSS business? Like in terms
well, it would have had a big impact on CSS. At that stage, I wasn't part of them, and they seemed to be able to work around it. They seemed to have got enough spare capacity in there. There were only 2 or 3 that were really, because of the way they worked, there was 2 or 3 projects that were really crucial, and they were the ones that had to be, deinstalled as quickly as possible. A lot of the stuff was sitting there as backup. So, yeah, it had an impact, but that was back in the days when there was the flexibility that they could work around it, really, if necessarily they could buy additional machines.
Just describe DEC campus. You said you were there. What was the campus like back then? You spent some time there. Describe it, and what was I suppose, how well was it integrated in with Reading? Was there a vibe with Reading at all? Was it the surrounding area?
Well, Digital got all these offices all over Reading, and that's when they said, the only way we're going to get enough space is to build our own building, and that's when they built DEC Park 1 out near the M4. And we were quite excited because we were told, you're going to move into this new building, and that was about the time that the service organisation was moved to Basingstoke. So we were able to get, Arkwright Road was a lot of very old, decrepit buildings. They were able to move out all of those into DEC Park. I think they moved out of King's Road at the time into DEC Park. All the admin moved in there. It was just a bit like sort of a massive, if you imagine a great big supermarket, one of these really, really big supermarkets, it was that sort of a building, full of office space with this lurid green carpet on the floor, which I think was sort of most to relax you by providing you with a relaxed atmosphere. There was an upstairs, and there was a downstairs, but everybody was working in these little pens, these little pods. And so in a way it was very faceless, that you walked past all these pods and you didn't really know who these people were. But there was this massive great aisle from the front to the back of the building, and that was sort of intended to be a sort of social area. It had a few chairs and that on it. There was free coffee, always free coffee at Digital, from the coffee machines, tea and coffee. I'd say it was the best coffee, but it was free. And you were encouraged to, get together when you needed to have a meeting on one of these informal tables. And then down one end we had a massive great canteen with really nice food, and they did things like get people in at, they got, on one time they got a load of dentists in to tell people all about dental health. There was always something like that going on to try and, provide sort of, I don't know, training and widen people's minds. And there was always encouragement to look at other parts of Digital that you might like to work for, even if you were given opportunities to go and do things if you asked for them. There was, I think, some ponds outside the front of the deck part 1, which apparently were there for fire purposes. So if there'd been a fire, the pond would have been used to extinguish the fire, although not in the computer room, obviously. And then after we'd been there a few years, they then built deck part 2, which is a much smaller, cosier building out the back, which was very much about trying to build some technical product, software development expertise in the UK, and not have it all in the US. And that my sister came to work for Digital at that stage, and my future brother-in-law was a software engineer, and so that's how they met. So we had the whole family working for Digital, and it was a bit like that really. That everybody knew everybody.
Did your wife work for DEC as well?
No, she didn't.
She was raising the kids. What and how did I suppose Digital fit into the Reading area? Was there a sense of us and them, or was it many people working? You said it was very family. Did many people from Reading work in there, or were people kind of commuting in from far away?
Well, I think it was a big employer in Reading. Certainly, we very soon filled deck part, and they were taking on other buildings like Acre Road, just up the road, took King's Road back on again. Never did move out of Fountain House. So there was Digital all over Reading, and it was very much seen as a lot of people who lived in Reading worked for Digital. But more than that, I don't know really. I didn't actually live in Reading because I lived out Wokingham and then Bracknell. So.
And I suppose just finally, just reflect on it. What do you think the legacy is of DEC from your perspective, either in terms of its commitment to Reading, or generally where has it left technology? How should we think of Digital? How should we think of Digital today? Because obviously the company has no longer existed. What do you think its lasting legacy would be? And that could be in product technology.
Yes, well, I think what Digital did is made Reading a bit of a centre for IT, and a lot of people who left Digital went off and set up their own companies and organisations, and that, with some of which may well still be running today. So it provided a huge sort of focus for IT in the Thames Valley, as part of the success of the area really, and the growth of Reading.
And what do you think its legacy is for you personally?
Well, I learned a lot of things at Digital from the management training. Taught me a lot of skills, and certainly I learned an awful lot about computers, so I've always been very familiar with them. And Eventually I ended up working for the Landmark Trust up in Maidenhead, which is a charity that rescues historic buildings, and I got that job based on the fact that I was comfortable working with computers, and virtually nobody at Landmark was comfortable with working computers, and so they were struggling to cope with them, and I was able to come in and help them. So it gave me that sort of comfort with them, that eventually it became much less about the hardware, because hardware became reliable, and much more about the software. But I mean, I still remember being given a training on a PC. It's the first. Digital didn't sell PCs, but eventually they were forced to do so because they were obviously becoming the big thing, and so we were trained on PCs and being taught about spreadsheets and all that sort of stuff. And just such useful knowledge that nowadays everybody's expected to have it. But it certainly helped me, given me that, really, in my whole life of being around computers. And back in the old days, I used to tongue-in-cheek say they'll never catch on, but of course they did.